EPR 594. This week we're going to talk about ethics and research. In this module you'll find videos to the Belmont Report that give some examples of some ethical issues and what we do now to address these issues. You'll also see a video on what is the IRB. The video is from another university, but IRBs are everywhere in the States as part of what came out of the Belmont Report. But I did want to talk a little bit about what IRB is at UAB in particular and what some of these terms mean when we talk about the IRB. You don't have to do IRB for this class, but if you are interacting with human subjects, so when you're doing a dissertation or a thesis, anytime you're collecting data or working with data that was collected from human subjects, so any human participant in a study, you will have to go through the IRB, which stands for the Institutional Review Board. To kind of tell you a little bit about IRB, what the different parts of it are, what they mean, and more importantly, what it looks like at UAB, I want to go ahead and go through UAB's IRB system. So if you just Google UAB IRB, the first result that you get should be Office of the IRB at UAB. Once you go to their page, here you go. We will be right on the homepage through UAB Research. The IRB actually comes through federal regulations that have to do with the protection of human subjects. If you're watching this video, you just watched the video of the Belmont Report, where they discuss some ethical issues that have happened in research in the past. And so because of these issues and because of these experiments that were done unethically and the harm that they caused to human subjects, the federal government required all human subjects research to go through an institutional review board. So whenever we're talking about research, we really want to define what research means. So if you're doing something for this class, for example, if you're doing a study for a class, UAB's IRB does not consider that to be actual research. You're not sharing it with anybody. You're not going to be doing anything crazy and invasive. You're not taking biopsies or trying out new medication or anything for this class. So UAB generally just considers that part of what you're doing for a learning practice and doesn't really consider that to go through IRB. However, it's always a good idea to go through IRB if you have the time. So when I say the time, what am I kind of talking about? What are they looking for? What kinds of things is this process like? You'll see here they're talking about the revised common rule. The Belmont Report was done in the 70s, and then the policies that we were using for our most recent IRB, I believe, came out at about 1991. Just recently, and by recently I mean this past January 21st, 2019, they changed some of the stipulations for some of these things. So revised common rule, that's what it's referring to. Those of you that have worked with the IRB before, this is referring to that. Let's see. So the first thing you'll do with the IRB is that you'll do training through the IRB. You won't do that for this class. We used to do it in the past, but the training has become more and more complicated. If you take GRD 717, you do some of this IRB training. But if you go through that link, training and initial IRB training, it'll give you some options on how to do that initial IRB training. If you've already done it and you just need to update or renew your certificate, that continuing IRB training link, refresher training, is also an option. Okay, so I'm back on the home page. The main thing I want to talk about here, see if we go to participants, you can find some information there. If you go to guidance and guidebook, there's some information kind of defining what a lot of these terms mean. It describes what the IRB does, what the application process looks like. You'll see everything here, the definitions, compliance and monitoring. So this is really something that students tend to not really look for. They're not expecting it to be there, but it can be very beneficial whenever you're doing that type of work. So I just wanted to talk about some of the big ideas that are in here. So first of all, human subjects research. This is UAB's definition of research based on the federal regulation. So any activity that is either a research as defined by DHHS regulations and involves human subjects as defined by those regulations, or research as defined by the FDA that involves human subjects and their regulations. So again, they're using these federal regulations generally for our research when we're talking about human subjects research in the social sciences, because this is going to pertain to medicine. Everybody goes through the IRB if they're working with people. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're in the social sciences. So for us in the social sciences, human subjects really have to do anytime that we're interacting with an individual in person, or if we're using information that was collected from someone. So you might be collecting primary data. Let's say you're doing some interviews, or you're doing a pre-test and a post-test of some type of physical therapy regimen. You're interacting with those people and collecting data, but that data could also be secondary data. So perhaps you have a data set of, you contact the state Board of Education and you get some information of student test scores. That is still information collected from human subjects. So this all falls into human subjects research, whether you're directly interacting with them or you're using secondary data. Let's see. I think that's all on this page. What I do want to talk about is the video on the Belmont report mentions things like informed consent, for example. So I do want to talk a little, unpack what some of those terms mean. I'm going to do that. We're going to look at these forms. So within these forms, you'll see way more than you ever need to know. If you're not doing a research study now, don't worry about this. But as you get closer to doing a dissertation or a thesis, that's my mom wondering how my snow day was. Just ignore that. All right. I'm too deep into this video to stop and start over. Anyway, so the main things to take away from these, or the main things I want to talk about here, have to do with the types of IRB that we go through, as well as the types of consent that we get. And you'll see that reflected in these different forms if you want to know more about it, or if you're doing something that would relate to those different issues. This is where you would find the forms that you submit. So the IRB is a group of people. The IRB is the group of why is my internet going away? All right, so the IRB, I promise I'm not this spaced out all the time. It's our snow day today, and it's been a little crazy. Anyway, so the IRB is the Institutional Review Board. The Institutional Review Board is a board of actual people. Here at UAB, they are a group of faculty and researchers and administrators, and they really oversee and have to approve all of the research that we look at and the research that we're doing. When we're talking about the board, we are talking about that group of people, but the IRB also consists of staff working at the IRB office. Trying to see if it'll show us who they are. Nope, it's not showing me. Anyway, so there are a group of people that work at the IRB office. They're in the administration building, and they collect these forms, they review these forms, and depending on which type of form you fill out, which type of review you have to do, they may have different levels of experience with your form and different levels of interaction with you. So what do I mean by different levels of review? So IRB, the board of individuals and the group that works in that building are the people, and they look at different types of projects. The types of projects that we look at UAB as of today, it could change next semester with the new revised Common Rule. But as of today, what we look at is exempt review. And you can see these different forms here: expedited, exempt. There is the exempt review, there is the expedited review, and there is full review. And those three are in order of how complex and how invasive, for lack of a better word, your study is. So if you are just talking to teachers about something that they do in their classroom, about which textbook they chose and why, you are interacting with them, so that still falls under human subjects. So you still have to send in a form, but it's exempt from that big IRB board review. So you would send in that form. The people that work in our IRB office would look through it. If you meet the requirements of exempt and you have all the documentation there that they need, they will grant you permission to begin that study. What exempt means is that you're free to do the study. They don't see any major risks or issues for the participants that are in your study, and you can go forth and collect your data. And as long as you don't change anything that you're collecting, you just keep doing it. They're not going to keep checking in with you. The next level is if you're doing something that works with, it's either a little more invasive, it takes away a little bit more privacy perhaps, or maybe it's working with a group of people that are considered a special population in IRB language. And we covered some of those in that Belmont video. So anytime we're doing research with children, people that are have any type of disability, if we're working with women who are pregnant, if we are working with prisoners, for example, because they can't really give us consent. They're in a situation where they don't have a lot of say in being truly voluntary in what they're doing. And there are more examples of that. But if we're working with any of those special populations outside of, let's say, a K-12 classroom, we would have to do what's called an expedited form. Expedited is very similar to exempt, but it's got a little bit more added to it. So they're going to want more information from you in that particular form. They're going to be more, they're going to be much more in depth whenever they're reviewing that form in what they are expecting you to explain to the participants and what you explain to them. And you'll also have something what we call continuing review, where they'll check in with you every year to see where you are with the project. So it's a more intense review. There's more information required, and it's ongoing versus the exempt form that's pretty straightforward and upfront. And again, that is to mirror the increased risk to participants. It's expected that if you're doing an expedited form, you're probably doing something that's going to cause more risk to the people that are participating in your study. The final of those three options is the full review. Full review is not something that I don't think we've ever done in the School of Education here. Full review tends to be things that fall more on the clinical side. So if you're doing research of testing a new drug, maybe you're doing clinical trials on something, maybe you're collecting biopsies, you're doing something that could have that are either extremely invasive or could have a significant impact on the people who are participating. You would do full review. So full review is going to have an even more intense form that you have to fill out with even more attachments and supplementary materials. But unlike the exempt and expedited that go through our IRB office staff, a full review actually has to go to the actual IRB board, the actual faculty and researchers that sit on the board. They generally meet once a month and go through your application, and they make the judgments and any criticisms or additions that they want to see on that particular piece. So these again go from exempt to expedited to full review. Exempt being the one that's, I guess, lack of a better word, simplest out of the three, the one that's the least invasive for the participants. You're not doing anything with sensitive information. It's very, very simple, very low risk type of study versus expedited, where either you're working with a special population or you're getting a little more personal. The risk is a little higher. Maybe you're talking about a sensitive subject that could cause some psychological distress to your participants. That would fall under expedited. And then finally, full review is if you're doing something that can have the most negative impact or risk on your participants. So exempt to expedited to full review. And what they ask for you in these different types of applications is going to depend on which application you choose. If you're doing full review, they're going to want even more information, and you're going to have to be even more detailed in what the risk and benefits are to your participant. Now, the way that you define those risks and benefits to your participant is through a consent or assent form. This HIPAA authorization has to do with healthcare things. So if you're in community health and kinesiology, it might apply to you. I haven't had it apply to any of our students yet, so I'm not going to talk about it in detail here, but if you want to know about it, do ask me in class. What I do want to focus on is this idea of consent versus assent. So consent means that you are gaining informed consent. The informed part is very important. Informed consent means that they are fully aware of what's going on in the study. They know what the risks are, they know what the benefits are, they know the purpose of your study. They know that it's fully voluntary. They know that they could leave at any time. If there is any compensation, sometimes we give people, there's a small payment or something that they receive for being in a study. I think there's one with students right now where they get 2 free movie tickets if they complete a survey, for example. So all of that goes into a letter of consent. Another thing to consider when we're getting consent, the informed consent means that they are fully informed of what's going on. So not just that you put it in the letter, and I'm going to try to see if I can open up an example letter here. Sample consent. No internet. What? All right, well, let's try. This day is the worst day. I'm going to redo this video whenever I get to the office tomorrow. Our office is closed today. Anyway, consent, the informed part means that they actually understand what you put in there. So you could write a letter that includes risks and benefits and voluntary nature, but if you write it very academic, where it's above the reading level of the group that you're working with, or maybe you're working with people where English isn't their first language and it shouldn't be in English in the first place. All of these things come into that informed part of that. So generally we get them to sign something. It says that not only did we share that with them, but that we shared it with them in a way that they could understand. So that's informed consent. Right? The other option is assent over here. Assent has to do with somebody that cannot give consent. So through IRB rules and regulations, we generally don't say that small children can give consent, for example. They may not fully understand everything that's going on there. We would get their parents to sign the informed consent saying that they're giving permission for their children to participate. However, we do still want to recognize that that child, they're a child and they might not understand it, and their parents can give consent, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to respect the fact that the child is still an individual and the child still has a choice as to whether or not they want to participate. So assent is a form that we get from people who can't give consent, and assent usually comes with a form of consent. So you could do a study where you have a letter of informed consent and not a letter of assent, but you can't do a study with assent without having a letter of consent as well, right? So an example of this would be if you were using children at a school in a study. We did one where we were talking to children about obesity, childhood obesity. So we weren't at the school. They came to the UAB campus for the interviews, and they came with their parents. We got the parents to sign a letter of informed consent giving us permission to interview their child because their child was a minor. Also, we were working with children who had free lunch status, so they were lower income, and all the children that participated were minority students. So we would be working with a special population that we wanted to make sure was not was receiving. We wanted to make sure that they were understanding the risk and benefits, and that they weren't being taken advantage of in any kind of way. Again, going back to that Belmont report where disenfranchised groups tended to kind of take the brunt of research to benefit groups that were not necessarily in that same group. So when we're looking at that particular study with the children, in addition to their parents signing a letter of informed consent, giving us permission to speak to their children and to record it for our interviews, we also gave the children a letter of assent, which was written at the age level of the child. So the letter is written at a 7-year-old level or a 10-year-old level, depending on who we were talking to, where the children were asked to if they wanted to participate or not. If the child didn't want to participate, or if we started the interview and they changed their mind, then the interview's over. They're a child, they're a minor, but they're still a human subject, and we respect their choice to participate in a study or not. So when we're talking about consent or assent, both of them have to do with making sure people understand exactly what they're getting into, that there aren't any surprises, that they know exactly what the potential risks are to them, and that they also understand that they can leave at any time, that they're essentially doing us a favor by being in this study. So we want to make sure that we are protecting individuals. And that they understand their rights as a study participant. Whether we use consent or assent has to do with whether or not IRB has determined that that individual has the capacity to give consent. So if we're working with elderly patients, so I mentioned children earlier, that one's easy because they're minors. All of us, if we're not a teacher, we've been in school where you had to get a permission slip signed from your parents to go on a field trip. So the idea of having to sign for a child is pretty common. Other fields would be, or other topics would be, if we were working with older people who had dementia, if we were working with people that had some type of disability, so maybe someone who is, they're not a minor, but they have some type of psychiatric diagnosis to where they can't give full consent on their own. We would do this informed consent or assent for them as well. So those would be the different times that we use those. Again, you're not going to have to do these in this class, but I do want you to understand the language a little bit, because we throw these words around as researchers, and we tend to forget that that's some very academic lingo. If you're bored and you want to go through some of these, you can see all of the different types of forms that they can request. You don't do these for everything. Everything that's in here, you can kind of see down here: special population forms if you're working with children, if you're working with pregnant women or fetuses, if you're working with prisoners, you would have to do these extra forms. So all of these are available through the IRB website. Again, you don't have to do it for this class, but further on down the line, when you get started on your dissertation, this is kind of where you would go. When people talk about the IRB and doing an IRB application or an IRB packet, this is what they're referring to. In addition to these forms, you would also submit to the IRB anything else that you would use. So if you're giving a survey to your participants, you would give a copy of that survey to IRB as well. They want to review it and make sure that you're not asking any questions that could cause some psychological distress to the people you're working with, or that you're not including something in an interview questionnaire, for example, where maybe you're asking teachers what they don't like about their principal. That kind of question could get them fired, or could lead to some type of repercussions at their job. So they'll be looking for those kinds of things. They may also be looking to see if you're collecting people's personal information, or you asking questions about, their name or their address, something that could identify them. All of that comes into the IRB review. So I've rambled a little bit at this point, and this video is a hot mess from the internet going out and everything else. If you have any questions about the IRB, do let me know. The main points are that this exists everywhere in the United States. It exists in most other countries, but not all. In other countries, it exists in different forms, but anywhere in the United States, you'll meet an IRB. Every university has one. And this process is in place to make sure that researchers don't do anything crazy, that they're protecting the people that they work with. So if you have any questions, let me know in the module Q&A, or email me your question. And we can also discuss this a little bit next time we meet face to face. So let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you guys either online or in class. Have a good week.